comes from a sermon from Martin Luther King Jr. called A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. And in it he quotes from the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 60, when Jesus says to his disciples, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." I think that's so interesting, how we as a society view terms such as tough and hard and soft and tender. When I think of the word tough, I think of Ford trucks for some reason, which goes to show just how far Madison Avenue has seeped into my brain. King would call that soft-mindedness, actually. When I think of hard, though, I think of hard-hearted, or hard as nails, or too hard to handle. Oh wait, that was too hot to handle. Well, whatever. Hard can be both a positive and a negative sense, right? It can connote strength, but it can also mean intractableness. Softness, again, can be positive and negative. It can have the connotation of being gullible, an unwillingness to take a stand for anything in life. But it can also mean kindness and openness and gentleness. We have all of these parts within us, and the key is to find the balance between them and when it is appropriate to use each part. In the sermon, though, King specifically characterized tough-mindedness as someone with, and I quote, "incisive thinking, realistic appraisal, decisive judgment, being sharp and penetrating, breaking through the crusts of legends and myths, sifting the truth from the false, astute at discernment. They are strong, austere quality that makes for the firmness of purpose and solidness of commitment." And these, end quote, these are qualities, these are values that we hold as well. These are things we speak of all the time here. In our principles, we speak to the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Each week, we talk about being committed to living out our values in action in the world. In order to do this, like the snake, we must shed our skin and constantly renew ourselves. King speaks of soft-mindedness as being gullible and susceptible to the messages that we hear in the media, being prone to superstition and a willingness to accept the status quo, of being fearful of change. King speaks of soft-mindedness entering religion, how for too long religions have resisted change and has accepted religious truths from past as unchallengeable. This soft-mindedness is why so many religions have feared science. It's why Galileo was jailed by the church, and why for too long certain religions have justified and still justify slavery, misogyny, and denied same-gender marriage. This soft-mindedness is why so many religions today as well still reject humanity to be good stewards of the earth due to climate change today. King did not fear science. No, not at all. In fact, he embraced it. And in this same sermon, he states that soft-mindedness, and I quote, "soft-mindedness has led to widespread belief that there is a conflict between science and religion. But this isn't true. There may be a conflict between soft-minded religionists and hard-minded, tough-minded scientists, but not between science and religion. Their respective worlds are different and their methods are dissimilar. Science investigates, religion interprets. Science gives human knowledge, which is power. Religion gives human wisdom, which is control. Science deals mainly with facts. Religion deals mainly with values. The two are not rivals, they are complementary. Science keeps religion from sinking into the moors of crippling irrationalism and paralyzing obscurantism. That's my word for the day, obscurantism. Religion prevents science from falling into the marsh of obsolete materialism and moral nihilism. Boy, he could turn a phrase, moral nihilism. And that's an end quote. So thus it matters. It matters what our values are, what religious values that we hold up. Is why I feel it's so important that liberal religion must be strong, must be a strong voice in the community for the values that we uphold, the values that we specifically point to in our vision and mission: welcoming, diversity, religious freedom, social justice. These need to be heard and to be integrated into the larger community, or else the only values that will be heard in the larger community will be those who speak of the values of oppression. But to have toughness without tenderness leads to mere utilitarianism and blinds us to the unnecessary suffering in the world. Having tenderness lets us lead with compassion and with love and caring and seeing people as people and not just means to an end. We sometimes forget that the means can be the ends. I have to admit, the past few months I have struggled mightily with my values surrounding the numerous cases of police shootings of unarmed black men, particularly Michael Brown. And this past week I was in Chicago for a couple of days with Quad Cities Interfaith at a Gamaliel of Illinois training and planning meeting. And Gamaliel is a congregationally based community organizer, the one actually which Barack Obama came out of. The trainer in her opening remarks kept telling us that to find where our racial problems stem from, that we have to go to the boiler room. Now, I have to say, with my lack of knowledge of heating systems, this analogy did not really work for me. But her point was to go deep into the founding documents, the core of our country and of any organization. And she reminded us how the United States Constitution, in its origin, declared slaves were only 3/5 human. That laws of this land were crafted with the idea of controlling African Americans. From the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that required escaped slaves to be returned to their owners, from the Dred Scott Supreme Court case in 1857, which is a sign that Dred Scott actually stayed here in Davenport for a few years, which was part of the case, that he was in a free state for a time, and therefore he claimed that he should be considered free. But this case in 1857, the Supreme Court declared a slave was always his master's property, and that free African Americans were not citizens. And then after the Civil War, when slavery ended, the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson legalized separate but equal rights and ushered in almost a century of Jim Crow laws which deprived African Americans of their rights. And then not long after, the Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil and Voting Rights Acts were enacted to eliminate Jim Crow laws in the 1960s. There was the enactment of the War on Drugs. And through its tactics and implementation seemed to be another way that our society is controlling African Americans and restricting their rights. There is a trend in this country that seems to not want to value equality of opportunity for all people, not value freedom for all people, not value justice for all people. And as I was thinking about this, and Michael Brown, I thought of Claudette Colvin. I imagine most of you have never heard of Claudette Colvin, but I imagine many of you have heard of Rosa Parks. We know of Parks' story of refusing to give up her seat to a white person, and that was the instigation for the Montgomery bus boycott on December 1st, 1955. Now, what many people don't realize, of course, is that this was not a spontaneous event. Parks was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, and her actions, her lawsuit, and the boycott were all orchestrated. So you may ask, who is Claudette Colvin? Claudette Colvin, upon returning home from school on March 2nd, 1955, some 9 months before Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat to a white person. She was 15 years old and was actually sitting in the black section of the bus. But when the buses were crowded, blacks were required to give up their seats to whites. This 15-year-old refused to give up her seat. She was arrested, just like Rosa Parks. She filed a lawsuit, just like Rosa Parks. But we never hear of her. As an aside, she did live in the Bronx for many years, and that is how I heard of her, actually. The reason why, though, we never hear of her is that Colvin was a teenager and became pregnant while unmarried during the time of her trial. And according to author Philip Hoos, and I quote, they worried they couldn't win with her. Words like mouthy, emotional, and feisty were used to describe her. Mrs. Parks, on the other hand, was considered stolid and calm and unflappable. End quote. Margot Adler on NPR said that, and again I quote, black organizations felt that Rosa Parks made a better test case for integration because she was an adult, she had the right hair and look to make her appear as middle class, end quote. And then I looked in the boiler room. It was not Rosa, this surprised me, it was not Rosa Parks' court case that changed the law. It was Claudette Colvin's court case that made it to Supreme Court. And it was Claudette Colvin's court case that ended separate but equal laws in this country. And that brings me back to Michael Brown. He is not the best test case, right? He has a criminal record. He may have attacked the police officer who shot him, maybe while fearing for his own life. We will never know. But nevertheless, it's a complex case with differing eyewitness testimonies. Yet still he was unarmed, he was shot 6 times, and he was left in the street dead for 4 hours. I'm not here to argue the case of Michael Brown, because there will never be a perfect victim. There will just be more victims. So we have to start somewhere. And I am here to point out the long lineage of our white-controlled society oppressing African Americans. I'm here to point out the experience of African Americans over time includes violence and death at the hands of law enforcement. In the South, during Jim Crow, lynching African Americans men was a very common practice. Since the war on drugs started, harassment, arrests, seizures of property, and elimination of Fourth Amendment rights against people of color have colored their experience with law enforcement. More recently, with the advent of social media, of course, we are hearing, it seems like one after another, we are hearing of unarmed African Americans being killed. Eric Garner in New York illegally choked to death. Tamir Rice, a 14-year-old, playing with a toy gun in the park without even notice, is shot without warning. John Crawford in a Walmart, shot to death while he was holding a pellet gun from the sporting goods section of Walmart. He just picked it up. And he was shot by the police while talking on his cell phone. Now let's be clear, those are just the most publicized ones that we've heard about. There are many more that we know of. How many even know that the NAACP office in Colorado was bombed last week? It got hardly any national press on that at all. And so there is we have to admit there is a bias in this country, some intentional, but I imagine mostly unintentional, including a conditioned fear that white people have when they engage with people of color and African Americans in particular. And the only way to overcome this is to engage more with communities of color. And so I encourage you tomorrow to attend one of the two Martin Luther King Day celebrations. There's one here in Davenport, United Neighbors at 10 o'clock, and one at Rock Island at the MLK Center at 10:30. I encourage you to attend. This violence and overt bias isn't true of all people or all police, but when it happens, we must acknowledge it. We must acknowledge that although drug use is the same between whites and people of color, arrests for drug use are far, far more disproportionately higher for people of color. We must acknowledge that the impact of the war on drugs has had the same impact that slavery and Jim Crow had on communities of color, which has been to diminish the family, to keep people of color in poverty, and to limit the rights and opportunities for people of color. We must acknowledge that there seems to be an intentional long-term plan by some in power in this country to maintain power by promoting competing oppressions amongst those who are disadvantaged. We must acknowledge that silence on these issues is soft-mindedness. If we do not acknowledge this, then we will be surprised at the next uprising, such as we saw in Ferguson after Michael Brown's death. At some point, people say, enough is enough. Now, I have to be honest, here in Davenport, and maybe because we have a lesser population of people of color, there does not seem to be as much tension as there are in larger cities. Yet it is clear that more and more people, more and more whites, are moving to Bettendorf and Pleasant Valley, and Davenport schools are starting to be starved for money. Schools that are now going to have a higher percentage of children of color, schools where more and more children are now living in poverty. And I want you to think about what the ramifications of that are going to be 10, 20 years from now. Do you know that they do long-term planning for prison population based on second-grade reading levels? That's a pretty shocking thing. So yes, I would tell you, caring about this issue is partially a self-interest. But King, however, was talking about being tender-hearted. We must not look at what is just in our own self-interest, for it is easy to delude ourselves as to what's in our own self-interest. But we need to look at what is the just way to act to build the beloved community for all people. And so I ask you, what beacon are we shining from this hill onto the community? What work are we doing to combat systemic racism? It's not an even playing field. So I encourage you to engage. I engage in the struggle for justice. It's not enough for us to just be good people. Because if we're good people, we do not act to stop injustice, then we are allowing others who oppress to stand unopposed. By doing nothing, we are complicit. And that is what was meant by an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There is a better way. We know there is. Our religious principles point us in that direction. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed us to that mountaintop. So let us take up that mantle. Let us not let his legacy be unfinished. Let us be tough-minded and discern what needs to be done. And let us be tender-hearted enough to care enough to do so. May it be so.